Science fiction has always thrived on imagination, yet some of its most influential films may have emerged from sources far more enigmatic than creative inspiration alone. Behind official credits and polished production histories lie stories of untraceable manuscripts, early drafts with no documented authorship, and pages that surfaced briefly before slipping back into obscurity. These mysterious documents scattered across decades of filmmaking whisper of origins that challenge the conventional narratives of how science fiction is built. Archivists and producers occasionally hint at drafts that appeared without explanation, printed pages with no submission records, revisions, penned in unfamiliar handwriting, or manuscripts routed into development rooms, despite lacking any official documentation. Filmmakers remember receiving story materials they later could not account for, while longtime studio staff speak of script versions that were discussed, debated, and quietly discarded, yet today exist in no archive. Even fans have uncovered strange fragments at auctions or in forgotten storage boxes, pieces of narrative architecture that match neither released films nor any publicly known draft. Patterns begin to emerge from these anomalies. They suggest the presence of unseen creative contributors, writers whose identities were lost, omitted, or intentionally withheld. Whether these shadow figures were early collaborators, anonymous storytellers, or individuals who never sought recognition, their fingerprints seem embedded in the foundations of films that shaped the genre's evolution. And in some cases, their contributions appear to predate conceptual breakthroughs that define these works today. Tonight, we explore 15 films whose earliest forms remain shrouded in uncertainty. Each one reveals a different kind of disappearance, drafts that circulated without attribution, outlines no one remembers, crafting, and story frameworks that appeared too polished to be accidents. These vanished origins invite us to question how much of science fiction's legacy is built on voices, history never recorded, and what other hidden narratives may still lie buried in studio vaults. 1. Edge of Tomorrow, the draft that went missing before approval. Though Edge of Tomorrow is marketed as a streamlined, high-concept adaptation of All You Need Is Kill accounts, from early pre-production point to a darker, more intricate screenplay that circulated briefly before being erased from the development timeline. Known among insiders as the looping Genesis draft, this manuscript allegedly portrayed the time loop mechanics with far greater brutality and psychological decay, placing heavier emphasis on the protagonist's deteriorating grip on identity. Readers who encountered it describe a relentless structure, with each loop growing more fragmented, as if the narrative itself were unraveling. Battlefield descriptions were hyper-detailed, almost grotesque, emphasizing the physical and mental toll repeated death inflicted on the soldier. The draft also explored the alien intelligence in a far more abstract manner, suggesting the loops might be distortions created not deliberately, but as a byproduct of non-human perception, a concept entirely absent from the final film. When attempts were made to integrate the looping Genesis draft into the official development pipeline, staff realized that the document lacked all authentication markers. It bore no cover sheet, no timestamp, and no author identification. Shortly thereafter, the draft vanished, and the next logged version reflected a notably lighter tone, reinforcing speculation that the darker manuscript had been deliberately removed. Some hypothesized that the Genesis draft was an early adaptation attempt discarded for tonal reasons. Others believe it came from a writer temporarily hired to explore philosophical angles the studio ultimately rejected. A persistent minority speculates that legal concerns over fidelity to the source material compelled the studio to purge it entirely. Its disappearance leaves an intriguing possibility. Edge of Tomorrow, a film built on repeated timelines and erased possibilities, may itself have been shaped by a version that was looped out of existence, an origin draft forgotten before it could be formally acknowledged. 2. Moon, the version that revealed too much about the clone. Behind the minimalist structure of Moon lies an obscure rumor about an early script version that went far deeper into the ethics and mechanisms of lunar cloning than any officially preserved draft. This version, remembered by a small number of early production readers as the expanded operations script, offered chilling insight into the corporate architecture surrounding the clone's creation and disposal. Yet no one has been able to locate a single trace of it within studio archives. Those who reportedly examined the expanded operations script recall that it read like a hybrid between technical documentation and psychological study. It introduced detailed logs of previous clones, clinical breakdowns of memory implant procedures, and scenes set within restricted areas of the lunar base. These sequences describe not only how the clones functioned, but why they deteriorated the physiological and psychological collapse built into their design. Many of these ideas appear only faintly in the final film, although they shaped its emotional undertone. Attempts to authenticate the script were unsuccessful. No metadata accompanied the file. No author was credited, and no payment entries aligned with its supposed creation. Some staff believed the draft originated from a research consultant brought in briefly for world-building purposes. Others argued that it was an unsolicited submission, so detailed it temporarily influenced internal discussions. The most unsettling theory is that the studio removed the script precisely because it unveiled too much, presenting the cloning procedures with a level of scientific specificity that might have shifted the film's classification or raised legal concerns about real-world parallels. Though the expanded operations script disappeared entirely, its conceptual shadow lingers. Moon's claustrophobic atmosphere and emotional resonance seem indebted to a version of the story too disturbing, too revealing, or too complex to survive in public view. Its absence reinforces the film's core theme: certain truths are constructed to be hidden. 3.
Sunshine, the draft that reframed the mission but left no author behind.
During the formative stages of Sunshine, long before its visual language and psychological tone were finalized, a strange alternative draft circulated briefly among a handful of department supervisors. This document, later remembered only as the reframing draft, presented a radically different interpretation of the crew's journey toward the dying sun. Unlike Alex Garland's confirmed versions, the reframing draft leaned heavily into the internal dissolution of human identity under extreme solar proximity, treating the mission as less of a survival effort and more of a gradual surrender to a cosmic force beyond comprehension. Those who encountered it recall an incredibly stark writing style, almost scientific in cadence. The draft described sensory hallucinations as mathematical distortions, emotional fractures as responses to radiation frequencies, and interpersonal conflicts as manifestations of neurological degradation. Several sequences focused on characters losing their sense of physical boundaries, perceiving themselves as expanding or dissolving into surrounding light. These scenes do not exist in any archived draft, yet the final film's fragmented sun-blurred imagery echoes their influence. When attempts were made to integrate the reframing draft into the official development record, it became clear the manuscript lacked all identifying metadata. No submission logs, no writer agreements, no emails referencing its handoff. A few staff speculated it might have come from a scientific consultant offering psychological notes rather than narrative structure. Others believed it began as an internal experiment, quickly abandoned, then mistakenly circulated. Regardless of origin, the draft disappeared almost immediately, though elements of its conceptual DNA seeped into the film's final tone. The Icarus mission's depiction of existential unraveling, the blurred distinction between physical and metaphysical threat, and the overwhelming presence of the sun all carry faint signatures of the vanished manuscript. To this day, the reframing draft remains a missing thread, an uncredited influence that helped shape the film's hypnotic descent into cosmic dread. 4. The Prestige, the unknown writer who shaped the illusion. While The Prestige is widely associated with the Nolan brothers' intricate storytelling, a forgotten manuscript once circulated during adaptation, a manuscript that no one recalls commissioning yet, which contained bold narrative expansions and psychological reinterpretations. Often referred to as the unseen adaptation, this version delved deeply into the philosophical implications of duplication, obsession, and the erosion of identity, presenting concepts that subtly influenced the film even though the draft was never formally integrated into the production. Crew members who reviewed the unseen adaptation described a voice unlike that of Christopher or Jonathan Nolan. It was colder, more methodical, and preoccupied with the moral distortions created by technological imitation. Scenes imagined in this draft variations of Tesla's machine, fragmented consciousness sequences, and extended confrontations between mirrored selves bear thematic resemblance to the final film, despite not appearing in any verified drafts. Script coordinators attempted to catalog the manuscript but found no metadata, no contract reference, and no trace of external submission. A single production note labeled it as material provided externally, though no follow-up documentation clarifies what that meant. Shortly after, the document vanished from the workflow, replaced by official rewrites with no mention of its influence. Those familiar with the adaptation process claim that certain tonal decisions, especially the film's fixation on sacrifice and identity disintegration, align more closely with the unseen adaptation's psychological framing than with earlier drafts. Whether these parallels indicate direct borrowing or mere coincidence remains unknown. The disappearance of the unseen adaptation reinforces the Prestige's central theme, that great illusions often rely on unseen architects. If an uncredited writer truly contributed to the film's emotional and conceptual foundation, their work remains hidden in the shadows, mirroring the duplicity the story itself examines. 5. Looper, the script file the system could not account for. During the early scripting phase of Looper, an anomaly emerged inside the studio's digital repository, a file containing a fully structured screenplay that appeared without authorship timestamps or any recognizable digital footprint. The mysterious file, temporarily labeled Script Temp, mapped out a narrative architecture remarkably close to the film's final structure, yet its prose style diverged sharply from Rian Johnson's known writing. The discovery raised immediate questions that no one was able to answer. Team members who studied the file recall how calculated its depiction of time loops felt. Characters were portrayed with a clinical detachment, their psyches dissected as they endured recursive trauma. Scenes involving the collapse of personal identity across repeated cycles were described with disturbing intimacy. Several of these concepts, though ultimately softened or removed, echo subtly in the atmosphere of the finished film. The digital anomaly deepened when IT staff attempted to recover the file's origin. Forensics revealed nothing. No creation signature, no modification pathway, not even evidence the file had been transferred between systems. It was as if it had materialized from nowhere. When Johnson reviewed the draft, he reportedly acknowledged certain structural similarities but denied authorship entirely. Discussions about the file appeared throughout internal meeting notes before it was abruptly deleted. Some staff believed the script came from an external writer who gained backdoor access to studio systems. Others suggested it was an experimental draft generated for internal study, never meant to be mistaken for actual development material. Yet the fact that several narrative decisions in Looper parallel ideas found only in this ghost file has fueled years of speculation. Whether it was an unauthorized submission, an abandoned exploratory draft, or the work of an uncredited contributor, the unexplained file remains one of the most unsettling mysteries behind Looper's creation, an origin story written by someone the system itself failed to acknowledge. 6. Interstellar, the pages that entered the workflow without a trace. Long before Interstellar settled into the form audiences now know, a peculiar cluster of pages circulated early in development, pages that did not match any confirmed draft by Jonathan Nolan, Christopher Nolan, or Kip Thorne. These documents, described by those who encountered them as the unanchored pages, contained eerily sophisticated interpretations of multidimensional space emotional resonance, encoded through gravitational forces and a more elaborate conceptualization of time as an elastic construct. Yet the pages bore no author's name, no contextual notes, and no metadata linking them to the studio's script pipeline. Assistants who handled the unanchored pages recall how strangely polished they felt. The descriptions of the Tesseract were incredibly detailed, portraying it not merely as a spatial anomaly, but as a living architecture reacting to human cognition. Several of these descriptions mirror ideas that later surfaced in rewrites, even though the production timeline suggests the Nolans had not yet reached those conceptual breakthroughs. Handwritten annotations, unfamiliar to anyone on the writing team, offered cryptic suggestions about emotional focal points and transitions between temporal layers. When archivists attempted to determine the page's origin, they found no email transfers, no login activity, no evidence the file had ever existed digitally. Some speculated that the pages may have come from an early scientific consultant who chose to remain uncredited. Others believed they were fragments from a longer, anonymous treatment delivered privately during pre-production. Regardless of their origin, the unanchored pages disappeared as quietly as they arrived. Yet the conceptual fingerprints they left behind are unmistakable. The final film's interplay between memory gravity and dimensional overlap carries the tone of those untraceable documents. If these pages did influence Interstellar, they represent the work of a mind that contributed profoundly before vanishing completely from the official record. 7. Minority Report, the rewrite that haunted early development. While Minority Report is often framed as a sleek fusion of action and ethical inquiry, early development staff speak of an uncredited rewrite that briefly influenced the project before disappearing completely. Known informally as the precog revision, this manuscript reportedly explored darker implications of predictive policing, emphasizing the moral rot embedded in a system built on involuntary clairvoyance. It proposed sequences involving abandoned precognitive experiments and hinted at the psychological deterioration of subjects forced to perceive endless futures. Individuals who engaged with the precog revision recall that its tone differed sharply from any officially recognized draft. It treated the pre-crime infrastructure as a decaying framework, cold, institutional, and riddled with ethical failures. Several atmospheric touches described in the missing rewrite, such as ruined monitoring facilities and discarded neural interface prototypes, echo in production notes, but never surface in surviving script versions. Attempts to incorporate the revision into the formal documentation pipeline faltered when staff realized no author was attached. The manuscript bore no payment record, no work for hire contract, and no correspondence thread. Version tracking software showed an unexplained numerical gap during the period when the manuscript was said to have circulated, suggesting it occupied a temporary space between drafts before being deleted from the system. Some insiders attribute the revision to a consultant hired momentarily to push the story toward a more introspective direction. Others suspect it was an unsolicited rewrite that, despite its sophistication, was unusable due to legal or stylistic conflicts. The most intriguing interpretation is that the rewrite contributed essential thematic groundwork, moral ambiguity, collapsing trust, intrusive surveillance, before being quietly removed to preserve clear authorship. Whether accidental artifact or deliberate ghost draft, the precog revision casts a lingering shadow over Minority Report, leaving open the possibility that its most unsettling questions were shaped by a writer history has chosen not to record. 8. Event Horizon, the early descent draft that no archive contains. Behind the turbulent production of Event Horizon lies a peculiar rumor, an early screenplay that predates the shooting script, yet exists in no recognized archive. Described by those who handled it as the descent draft, the manuscript reportedly offered a far more elaborate account of the ship's journey beyond known space, treating the return of the Event Horizon not as a horror spectacle, but as an existential collapse triggered by contact with an incomprehensible realm. Readers recall the descent draft as unsettlingly ambitious. It portrayed time inside the ship as fragmented, looping, and infected by external physics. Characters experienced hallucinatory bleed-throughs, perceiving distorted versions of themselves projected across shifting dimensions. Certain atmospheric descriptions, twisted architecture corridors that lengthened as characters moved, shadows behaving independently of light later appeared in visual form, despite never appearing in the documented script versions. When attempts were made to retrieve the draft after principal photography began, staff discovered that no registration entry had ever been created. No version number, no writer's identification, and no timestamp tied it to the development pipeline. Some claimed the draft came from a conceptual consulting phase the studio preferred not to acknowledge. Others argued it was an unsolicited manuscript mistaken for internal material, then quietly purged when its origin could not be verified. Production diaries from early meetings include references to scenes that match eyewitness descriptions of the missing descent draft. Yet no draft containing those sequences exists today. The disappearance is compounded by the fact that many reels of cut footage from the film were also lost or destroyed, leaving researchers to wonder whether the missing screenplay and missing footage were somehow connected. 9. Donnie Darko, the draft that surfaced once and then slipped into myth. Among collectors and former crew, the legend of Donnie Darko's X7 draft persists as one of the strangest anomalies in the film's early development. The draft was rumored to have circulated briefly among script readers before vanishing entirely, leaving behind no official reference in the studio's tracking system. According to those who glimpsed it, the manuscript constructed the film's universe with a strikingly different narrative texture, denser, more enigmatic, and centered on temporal drift as a psychological phenomenon rather than a structural device. Readers who recall the X7 draft describe sequences that delved deeply into alternate world logic mapping paradoxes through coded dialogues and symbolic imagery. These passages reportedly expanded on the metaphysical architecture of tangent universes with a clarity and ambition absent from the surviving drafts. Even more unsettling were notations scribbled along the margins, notations in handwriting no one recognized, suggesting refinements that subtly prefigure themes later explored in the director's cut. Efforts to recover the document proved impossible. No paper copy survived. No digital record ever appeared in the studio's metadata logs. Yet, early production notes contain references to discussions clearly influenced by scenes described in the Phantom draft. Some staff recall that the X7 version initially guided brainstorming sessions, though no one recalls who introduced it to the team in the first place. Theories vary dramatically. Some believe the draft was an unsolicited submission misfiled into the workflow. Others contend it was an early abandoned experiment by Richard Kelly that he later rewrote so substantially that it bore no resemblance to the surviving script. A more persistent theory suggests the draft was intentionally pulled because it revealed too much of the film's intended metaphysics material producers may have felt would overwhelm mainstream audiences. 10. 2001 Space Odyssey, the hidden outline that predicted the film's final form. Although 2001 A Space Odyssey is widely regarded as a meticulously documented collaboration between Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C., Clarke's surviving correspondence hints at a mysterious outline that predates every verified treatment. This outline, referenced indirectly in a few early memos, appears to have mapped major conceptual beats of the film long before Kubrick and Clarke publicly articulated them. Yet, no surviving copy exists, and neither of the credited creators acknowledged writing it. People who recall encountering the outline describe it as strikingly prescient. It detailed the evolutionary leap prompted by an external intelligence, the psychological disorientation of deep space travel, and the transformation of consciousness beyond physical form. These ideas eventually defined the film's thematic core, but at the time the outline was allegedly written, Kubrick and Clarke were still exploring divergent narrative possibilities. The outline's confidence and its structural cohesion suggest a writer with an unusually clear understanding of the philosophical direction the film would take. When archivists later attempted to trace the document, they found anomalous gaps in the cataloging record, a missing submission slot, incomplete metadata, and notes that seemed to refer to a document removed before the archival system was formalized. Clarke's personal journals mention encountering a curious early summary, while Kubrick never addressed the rumors at all. Some scholars believe the outline was a discarded experiment by Clarke, produced privately and later abandoned. Others propose it came from a researcher or consultant whose contribution was intentionally obscured to maintain narrative clarity in the credits. A more provocative theory suggests the outline was used as a silent compass, an uncredited blueprint guiding the film's direction before being erased. Whatever the truth, the outline's absence invites speculation about the origins of 2001's visionary architecture. If such a document existed, it may have served as the unseen foundation for one of the most influential films ever created, authored by a voice history has quietly removed from view. 11. Dark City, the version that shifted tone but carried no signature. During the construction of Dark City's eerie urban maze, a strange version of the screenplay allegedly circulated among mid-level production staff, one containing radical structural alterations and expanded philosophical scaffolding, yet carrying no recognizable byline or timestamp. This draft, sometimes referred to in internal conversations as the restructuring version, framed the shifting landscape and memory rewriting mechanisms with a depth not found in archived drafts. Despite its sophistication, the document bore none of the hallmarks of an officially commissioned rewrite. Those who claim to have seen the restructuring version recall an emphasis on cognitive dislocation, identity splitting, and the psychological cost of living within a constantly reassembled world. Some of its scene descriptions, particularly those involving the city's transformation and the alien overseers, mirror visual concepts Alex Proyas implemented later. Yet these exact formulations appear nowhere in the authorized script lineage. Marginal annotations written in a cramped and unfamiliar hand suggested adjustments to pacing and thematic layering that mysteriously aligned with late-stage production changes. Attempts to integrate the draft into the official version tracking system failed because the document lacked the data required to authenticate its origin. Script coordinators could not match it to a contractor, and production managers denied commissioning such a rewrite. Shortly afterward, the draft vanished from circulation, leaving only brief references in meeting notes. Some staff speculated that the version came from an external writer hired off the books to propose tone refinements. Others believed it originated from an early abandoned iteration of the project that resurfaced accidentally. But the lack of archival evidence and the eerie similarity between its conceptual language and the film's final shape has led a number of researchers to wonder if an uncredited mind helped architect Dark City's haunting psychological terrain. Its disappearance only strengthens the film's legend, a story about stolen memories shaped perhaps by a writer whose own contribution was erased. 12. The Matrix, the Lee script that no one would claim. Before The Matrix became a cultural landmark, reshaping the grammar of sci-fi cinema, accounts from within the studio hint at the existence of a mysterious, uncredited screenplay that passed through internal circulation months before the Wachowskis' authenticated drafts were formally registered. This document, described by those who glimpsed it as a conceptual precursor, contained surprisingly advanced explorations of simulated perception, recursive illusion, and hidden frameworks of control ideas that would later form the backbone of the finished film, though expressed here with a colder, more esoteric tone. Individuals familiar with early development remember a script that included early blueprints for iconic sequences, a rooftop pursuit governed by altered physics, an anomaly described as a system echo, and exchanges hinting at a divide between human agency and machine oversight. Yet none of these scenes appear in the first verified Wachowski draft. Even more unsettling was the structure fragmented labyrinthine, written as if the narrative itself were resisting linear comprehension. Efforts to identify the author yielded nothing. The manuscript carried no title, no email trail, and no submission record. It existed only as a printed bundle that moved briefly across a few desks before vanishing. When questioned years later, the Wachowskis expressed no awareness of such a text, and Warner Bros. Declined to comment, insisting all development materials followed standard protocol. Some theorists argue that the precursor script was an unsolicited piece, mistakenly fed into the studio's developmental engine. Others believe it resulted from a short-lived collaboration with a consultant whose ideas were later absorbed, but whose name was intentionally omitted. A smaller, more speculative group suggests the draft was removed deliberately because acknowledging its existence would complicate authorship claims. 13. The Terminator, the uncredited Foundation draft. Long before The Terminator became an iconic study in fate and mechanized inevitability, rumors circulated about a skeletal draft that shaped the film's conceptual core yet carried no author's name. This early document, recalled by several former staff members, outlined a narrative involving a relentless pursuer from a fractured future, a lone survivor, determined to resist, and a timeline collapsing under paradoxes. The descriptions predate James Cameron's documented treatment, yet align uncannily with ideas he would later develop. Witnesses who briefly saw the uncredited draft describe it as abstract and philosophical, focusing less on technological spectacle and more on the psychological experience of being hunted by something that cannot be reasoned with. The manuscript reportedly included nonlinear reflections on destiny and recursion elements that mirror the thematic structure of the final film, but differ significantly in tone. None of the known early drafts contain these passages. When controversy later emerged over similarities between the film and pre-existing science fiction stories, some investigators attempted to locate the mysterious Foundation draft. It had already vanished. No submission logs, no payment records, no archival copies. The only evidence of its existence came from meeting notes referencing ideas from the early source. Speculation persists about the draft's origins. It may have been an unsolicited submission mistakenly incorporated into early brainstorming sessions. Others argue it was an exploratory internal piece, authored by someone who left the project early. The most persistent theory, however, is that it served as a conceptual springboard, a silent influence that informed Cameron's later work before being quietly discarded. If this lost manuscript truly existed, it reshaped the trajectory of modern sci-fi without leaving behind a shred of verifiable authorship. Its disappearance mirrors the film's own themes, a message sent back from an unclear origin altering the future before vanishing completely. 14. Alien, the unlogged prototype draft. Before Alien was cemented as a landmark in atmospheric horror, there were whispers of an early prototype script that seemed to precede all officially recognized versions. This manuscript, mentioned briefly in scattered production notes, contained elements that diverged sharply from the drafts attributed to Dan O'Bannon, while somehow anticipating the film's final thematic direction. No cover sheet, no attached correspondence, and no author credit accompanied it. It appeared briefly circulated among a few staff members and vanished without ever being formally logged. Individuals who claim to have handled the prototype draft recall a tone far more ritualistic and biological than any known version. It depicted the alien species through symbolic and evolutionary frameworks, framing the creature not merely as a threat, but as an inevitable product of cosmic design. Some descriptions mirrored visual choices Ridley Scott would adopt later, such as the biomechanical fusion of environment and organism, even though these ideas do not appear in authenticated early drafts. When archivists attempted to locate the script decades later, they found only cryptic references, memos noting concept material from unknown source annotations, in margins quoting lines not found in O'Bannon's drafts and production notes that seemed to respond to scenes no longer traceable. The studio denied ever receiving an uncredited submission, yet internal records hint that such a document did pass through the department. Theories vary widely. Some believe the prototype script may have been the work of an early design collaborator testing narrative angles before O'Bannon's direction solidified. Others suspect it was a speculative piece absorbed unintentionally into development conversations. A minority insists it was deliberately erased, its influence too substantial to ignore, but too mysterious to formally acknowledge. Though the prototype draft has vanished, echoes of its tone remain embedded in the film's DNA. Its disappearance leaves behind a lingering question: how much of Alien's primal terror originated from a writer whose name was never meant to be preserved? 15. Blade Runner, the script that entered development without a past. Long before Blade Runner took shape as a visual and philosophical landmark, an unusual screenplay circulated through early development meetings, one that no one in the writing or production team would later admit creating. Production staff who handled archival materials from the late 1970 is noted a peculiar reference to an initial framework draft, a document that did not match any of the credited writer's work. The pages contained dense meditations on synthetic consciousness, decaying urban futures, and existential questioning ideas that would eventually define the film, yet appeared here in a form that seemed too complete for an anonymous fragment. Crew members who reportedly read the manuscript described atmospheric details and character reflections that uncannily resembled scenes Ridley Scott would later realize, even though the draft predates his involvement. Certain descriptions, rain-soaked skylines, fragmented memories implanted into artificial beings, and moments of moral ambiguity align more precisely with the finished film than with any surviving early drafts attributed to Hampton Fancher or David Peoples. The writing style, however, bore no resemblance to either of them. Efforts to trace the document after production began turned up nothing. It left no submission trail, no name, not even a date stamp. The lone photocopy kept in the archives disappeared sometime during a department restructuring, leaving only secondhand recollections. Some have speculated that the draft originated from an uncredited story consultant. Others believe it was an unsolicited piece that accidentally slipped into circulation. What troubles researchers most is how influential the anonymous material appears to have been. Key thematic structures, questions of identity, autonomy, and emotional authenticity mirror the Phantom Draft's descriptions more closely than any documented rewrite. It is as if a forgotten author sketched the film's spiritual blueprint, then dissolved from the record entirely. If this mysterious draft truly shaped Blade Runner, the film's legacy may rest partly on a storyteller whose existence was never officially acknowledged. Prometheus, the early outline that vanished after one meeting. Within the development history of Prometheus, there exists a little-known story about an outline that surfaced only once during an early brainstorming session. Labeled simply as Origin Pathway, the document was said to present a brutally different explanation for the engineers' interest in Earth. Instead of portraying them as distant creators, the outline suggested they were custodians of a previous species whose extinction humanity was never meant to replace. Those who were present at the meeting recall the Origin Pathway outline as stark and unsettling. It envisioned the engineers returning to Earth not out of hostility, but out of obligation to correct what they perceived as a dangerous deviation in the evolutionary chain. The document described forgotten ruins, dormant genetic repositories, and hints that humanity carried traits intended for an entirely different purpose. Several of these ideas never appeared in any known draft, yet their atmospheric fingerprints linger in the film's world building. After the meeting, the outline was collected and never referenced again. The studio's script tracking system shows no entry matching its content, and those involved in development insist the document was exploratory material not intended for retention. Some believe it was part of a larger abandoned pitch exploring the engineer's mythology. Others think it may have originated from a writer who withdrew from the project before contracts were finalized. The disappearance of the Origin Pathway outline leaves a haunting possibility. Prometheus might once have drifted toward a narrative where humanity was not created by cosmic beings, but mistakenly allowed to exist. When we trace these vanished drafts and authorless pages, a picture begins to form, one in which the creative history of science fiction is far more fragmented than its official record suggests. These films, celebrated for their vision, may carry echoes of writers who stepped into the process only briefly, leaving no signatures behind. Perhaps they were collaborators whose names were quietly removed. Perhaps they were never meant to be acknowledged at all. What remains is a reminder that the origins of cinema's boldest ideas are often concealed, waiting in the shadows for someone willing to notice the gaps.